I suppose it would be appropriate for a new channel calling itself Socratic Inquiries to begin with a talk about Socratic inquiry. The figure of Socrates looms large over the Western philosophical tradition, and rightly so. He was born in Athenian in 469 and died in 399 BC. The son of a stonemason, he was a free citizen, but likely from what we would call the lower middle class. We have three direct literary sources for his life. The Clouds, a comedy by Aristophanes, first performed in and around 430, which lampooned him. Also a short series of dialogues by the great general Xenophon. And lastly, the dialogues of Plato, which are surely the greatest accounts of Socrates, and the ones I'll be most interested in here. Plato's works are usually divided by modern scholars into periods, early, middle, and late, although there is no consensus as to the exact chronological ordering of these works. It should be noted, though, that before the 19th century, no one took any interest in the chronological ordering of the dialogues. What does seem certain is that the works grouped as early depict Socrates engaging in discussions with various people, and usually on a single topic, let's say courage or piety or moderation, something like that, and it takes the form of what is X, and which determines then the course of the whole discussion going forward. These discussions always end inconclusively. That is, we never get a definition of X, although we do discover a lot about what X is not. According to contemporary scholarship, Plato's corpus is understood, broadly speaking, in the following way. These early dialogues are understood to depict something essential about Socrates, the philosopher, and while they are certainly not transcripts or historical records of conversations, they are fictions after all, it is generally believed that they do nevertheless display something essential about the man and his philosophy. Then comes the middle period, where these dialogues are commonly understood to show Socrates more and more becoming just the mouthpiece of Plato's philosophy. In the late dialogues, then, new main speakers appear, like the Eleatic stranger, a follower of Parmenides, the cosmologist Timaeus, and a figure called the Athenian. Some still depict Socrates as the leading speaker, but the content is now understood to be pure Plato. This, anyway, is the broad consensus of modern scholars of what is called developmentalism on how Plato's corpus is to be understood. They take the view that Plato's philosophy undergoes a significant development over time, which can be discerned in his writings. Another group, known as the Unitarians, are not really interested in chronological ordering and deny that Plato's thought undergoes significant development, which is not to say that it doesn't undergo some changes, just that these changes are not as substantial as the developmentalists claim they are. For the record, I myself veer more towards the Unitarian camp. For now, and for the next few YouTube talks in this series, I'll concentrate only on the so-called early period dialogues in order to get a sense of what scholars have dubbed the Socratic Method. Now, nowhere in Plato's writings does the phrase Socratic Method ever appear. This is a scholarly construction devised to describe a nevertheless definite and discernible pattern to what Socrates is doing in these dialogues. These dialogues are the Apology, Crita, Euthyphro, Charmides, Laches, Hippias Major, but the authenticity of that is disputed, Hippias Minor, Euthydemus, Protagoras, and the first Alcibiades, also a disputed authenticity. There are a few other dialogues of this kind, but their authenticity is defended by no one, and indeed some of them are obviously not by Plato. It's worth mentioning that the Socratic dialogue had become an established genre at that time, many being written by various authors, but only those of Plato and Xenophon survive, including the spurious group attributed to Plato. These early dialogues, except the Apology, which is not really a dialogue, follow a discernible pattern. Socrates famously claimed not to have knowledge, but at the same time regarded the possession of knowledge as the most supremely valuable thing possible for a human being to possess. He had firmly held convictions, of course, the value of knowledge being one of them, but he lacked knowledge itself and was acutely aware of this. In the Apology, which is his defence speech at his trial, he explains at length the origins of his public philosophical activities. One of his oldest friends, Chaerephon, had become so convinced that Socrates was the wisest man alive that he even went to the Delphic oracle to put the question in the hope that he would get confirmation of this. Quote, he once went to Delphi and dared to consult the oracle about this, and he asked if anyone was wiser than me. So the Pythia answered that no one was wiser, and his brother, who is here, will be your witness of this, since Chaerephon himself is dead. Chaerephon, of course, was delighted with this news. Socrates not so much. For as he said, quote, when I heard this, I reflected upon it as follows. What exactly does the god mean, and what on earth is the riddle he poses? For I myself am aware of being wise in nothing great or small. So what precisely does he mean when he says, I am the wisest? Of course he cannot be lying, since that is not lawful for him. And I was perplexed for a considerable time as to what precisely he meant. At the conclusion of these ponderings, Socrates resolved to test the oracle to discover its obscure meaning. He resolved to seek out and engage in discussion every class of person renowned for knowledge in some area, as well as those individuals who actually claim to have knowledge for themselves. Quote, in considering the meaning of the oracle, I had to go to all those who seemed to know something. My experience was something like this. When it came to understanding, those with the most exalted reputations seemed to me, as I searched at the god's behest, well nigh worst off, while other men of lower repute were better off. End quote. For after a series of carefully framed questions put to these reputed knowers during these conversations, it became clear that they did not in fact have knowledge of what they were speaking about. Needless to say, this mission of his created a growing number of enemies, especially amongst the politically ambitious, who resented having their epistemic pretensions and conceits exposed in this way. After some time had passed in this quest, Socrates finally discovered the meaning of the oracle. Quote, by this oracle, the god is saying this, that human wisdom is of little or indeed of no value, and he appears to be referring to me, Socrates, and what's more, he's using my name, using me as an example, as if he were to say, he among you, O humans, is wisest, who recognizes, like Socrates, that he is, in truth, worth nothing when it comes to wisdom. Ever since, Socrates devoted the rest of his days to what he characterized as his service to the god. Quote, so to this very day, I go about conducting these investigations, seeking out, at the god's behest, anyone, either citizen or stranger, whom I think to be wise, and once he seems not so to me, to assist the god, I show that he is not wise, and because of this occupation I have no time for any involvement in civic affairs worth mentioning, or for any private concerns either, but I am in utter poverty because of my servitude to the god. End quote. So there we have it, the ultimate aim of Socrates' philosophical mission, a kind of pious service to undermine the conceit of knowledge wherever it rears its head. Of course, Socrates is not content with simply going around refuting people out of their conceit of knowledge. If this is all he was about, he'd be not much more than a kind of troll. Indeed, among some, there was this suspicion that behind this famous disclaimer of knowledge, Socrates did indeed have knowledge, concealed behind what scholars have sometimes called Socratic irony. It is true that Socrates often speaks in a mood of irony, and a great deal has been written on this. So, for instance, Socrates encounters someone who claims expertise in topic X. Socrates then expresses delight at meeting such an expert and invites him to become his teacher, while he, Socrates, will be his student. Shortly after this, the putative expert is exposed, through careful questioning, to be anything but. Now, it's simply not credible that Socrates really does believe this man's claims about his knowledge in respect of X, which leads us to conclude that here we find only irony. Now, irony sharply divides people. There are those who despise it and those who employ it. It's a big and deep topic, best left for another time, but I must at least say something about Socratic irony here, no matter how cursory. In my view, Socratic irony preserves a certain kind of civility that is absolutely necessary for philosophical discourse, and it's entirely in keeping with Socrates' own disavowal of knowledge. The ironic mood begins from taking someone at their word, I am an expert on X, it can elicit a number of responses. 1. Yes, you are an expert and I am not. Please teach me. Or 2. Somehow I doubt that. Or 3. Yeah, sure you are. Response 2 and 3 are not compatible with Socratic ignorance because 2 provokes the question, well, what is the basis of your skepticism? While 3 is outright rude and implies that the speaker knows better. Both 2 and 3 also destroy the possibility of genuine dialogue, for the speaker of 2 or 3 are clearly taking a definite position. But this is not available to Socrates because of his self-avowed lack of knowledge, and run counter to the very conception of what constitutes philosophical activity, which is grounded basically in a kind of civility, and ultimately a kind of friendship grounded in a shared love of truth. Is the only consistent stance open to Socrates. If practiced gently, it goes a long way to neutralize in advance the dangers of polemical or confrontational moods from colouring the discussion and undermining and even destroying it. It preserves that basic civility that is necessary for this kind of encounter to proceed in some sort of constructive way, and it seems the only consistent mood open to one who claims not to have knowledge. Now, I want to turn and say something about the so-called Socratic Method, or method of inquiry. As one who lacks knowledge yet prizes its possession above all things, Socrates was ceaseless in his search for knowledge, and the method he employed was an important element in this. When we survey the so-called early or Socratic dialogues, we find that the topics under discussion are always what we would class as ethical, maybe even ethico-political. When Socrates disavows knowledge based on the subject matter of his inquiries, it would seem that it's ethical knowledge that he's talking about. However, I think we should be cautious about drawing any firm conclusions from this, as if Socrates is only interested in ethics, and that when he disavows possessing knowledge, he is only disavowing knowledge in ethics. For the ancient Greek philosophers, by and large, ethics is considered the gateway to philosophy in general, as it involves matters which are most readily accessible, because they are familiar to all. Everyone has views on justice, courage, moderation, and the like. And if the early dialogues have didactic purpose, it would seem that, at least in part, it's about initiating ethical inquiry and raising general philosophical questions like, what is knowledge? As opposed to, say, opinion. Now, the big idea in play in the so-called early dialogues seems to be something like this. If I think I have knowledge of X, but really do not, I will never take up inquiry into X, but will continue on, as usual, quite oblivious to my ignorance. Real ignorance is not so much not knowing X, but not being aware that one does not know X, but on the contrary, carry on in myself as if I do know X. This conceit of knowledge stands as a major obstacle to any kind of genuine inquiry, so for this reason it's necessary to remove the conceit of knowledge first, before any inquiry can really begin. That is, broadly speaking, the general aim of Socratic method as is shown in these early dialogues, at least in its negative aspect, that is, the removal of a blockage to inquiry. But then what is its positive aim, if any? This will become clear as we go along, but for the moment it's sufficient to say that the result of a process which shows that certain arguments fail is itself a positive contribution to an inquiry. In this way, we are interested in the question, what is X? X being placeholder term. So assume an argument with the conclusion X is A, defended by a putative knowledge claimant. Let's call him J. Now, assume an examination process led by Socrates or somebody like Socrates, which demonstrates to the satisfaction of the knowledge claimant J that X cannot be A. Well, now we have a double outcome. 1. The conceit of knowledge, that X is A, has been removed, and J is now free from this conceit. And 2. We now have very good reasons for affirming that the claim X is A is actually false. The negative result, the removal of the conceit of knowledge from J, is accompanied by a positive result, that X as A is false, has already advanced the positive inquiry into the what is X question, as well as freeing J from the conceit of knowledge about X. The removal of the conceit of knowledge, though, creates a kind of vacuum Where previously J thought he knew X, now he is certain that he does not. Socrates takes this to be more or less sufficient to motivate inquiry. For as the old saying goes, nature abhors a vacuum. If it is indeed part of our nature to love to know, and the result of a Socratic encounter is to be relieved of the conceit of knowledge, then it is reasonable to assume that a desire to fill that space with actual knowledge will motivate an inquiry that aims at precisely that, knowledge of X. So this touches on another aspect of Socrates' activities. He was no ivory tower academic, no one was back then, but a philosopher of the people, determined to free his fellow citizens from ignorance out of some kind of fraternal love, as he states at length in the Apology. But this is a large and important theme, which I'll take up in a follow-on talk to this one later in this series. Namely, what is the social role of the philosopher, if any? In the next talk in this series, I want to present a detailed step-by-step analysis of this method used by Socrates to remove the conceit of knowledge, and to do so in reference to relevant passages from various dialogues. I want to lead up to rounding out this series with a detailed reading of one of the early dialogues, the Euthyphro, and to that end I'm going to make an audio recording of the entire text as an audio book. All the quotes that I've used in this talk, taken from the Apology, are from the new translation of all of Plato's works by David Horan, and I'm going to put a link to his translation, which is online, in the description below. If you enjoyed this, please press the like button, and if you'd like to follow this series and future content, please subscribe and press the notification bell.